When you think of the 1985 St. Louis Cardinals, you're probably thinking of plays like this one. Or you might think of plays like this one.
There's a line drive in the left. They're kicking it around to watch Coleman. He's all the way to third.
The Cardinals also specialized in hitting triples like this one here.
Into the corner. Extra bases. Watch McGee run. He's going to go for three. He's going to make it.
But is it correct to say that the 1985 Cardinals did all of that based on their speed alone? Well, let's take a deep dive into the 1985 St. Louis Cardinals offense, otherwise known as Whitey Ball. As shocking as this might seem today, the 1985 St. Louis Cardinals actually were expected to finish close to last place. This comes from Baseball Digest season preview article. Street and Smith's, one of the most respected preseason publications, concluded that the Cardinals could not be a contender in 1985. Sports Illustrated was a little bit kinder. They predicted a 4th place finish for the Cardinals, which is similar to what they did in 1984. That's a pretty crazy prediction, especially when you realize that the 1985 Cardinals ranked 21st on the all-time National League Domination Index scale. This was absolutely one of the best teams of all time, and they had a great offense to boot. The reason why the Cardinals were predicted to fail is because they were pretty poor in 1984 and because they lost their ace reliever Bruce Sutter to Atlanta. We're not going to talk about pitching or defense today, however. We're only going to talk about the St. Louis offense. As good as the Cardinals' defense was, the offense is where things really get interesting. Now, most people who think about the 1985 Cardinals will conclude that rookie Vince Coleman was the reason why the Cardinals played so well. What we tend to forget is that Coleman wasn't actually with the Cardinals at the start of the season. St. Louis had decided to stick with Lonnie Smith instead, sending Coleman back to Louisville. Coleman, of course, had been an incredibly prolific base stealer in 2 seasons in the minor leagues, and many observers thought that he was ready for the big time. Vince didn't come up until the April 18th game against Montreal. He went 1 for 3 that day, but managed to steal 2 bases in the process. That was a preview of what was about to come. Coleman proceeded to steal an amazing 110 bases in his rookie season. That's a record that still stands. Well, you can see why people conclude that adding Coleman was what pushed the St. Louis offense over the top. However, if you look closely, you'll discover that it was likely something else. In the 1986 Baseball Abstract, Bill James argued that Coleman in 1985 wasn't significantly different from Lonnie Smith in 1984. If you look at the numbers, you can see James's point. Coleman hit .267 in 1985 with a .320 on-base percentage. He walked only 50 times and struck out a whopping 115 times. The 110 stolen bases were accompanied by 25 times caught stealing. Similarly, in 1984, Lonnie Smith hit .250, but he had a .349 on-base percentage. He walked 70 times. He only stole 50 bases, but he was also only caught 13. He also struck out a little bit less often. Now, if you compare the offense of the 1984 Cardinals with the 1985 Cardinals, you'll notice that the difference was really an on-base percentage. In 1985, the Cardinals hit for a better average and had a lot more runners on base. And of course, when you have an offense focused on running, having guys on base really helps a lot. I suppose part of the on-base percentage increase is because of Willie McGee, who hit .353 in 1985 despite walking only 34 times. The real difference, however, was this guy. Clark had been a mainstay of the San Francisco Giants offense for years. However, Clark was injured for most of 1984 and was frustrated after the Giants got rid of Joe Morgan. He wanted out. The Cardinals traded for Jack Clark on February 1st, giving up first baseman David Green, who hadn't hit well, and relief pitcher Dave LaPointe. You can see the difference on opening day at Shea when Jack Clark went yard off none other than Dr. K himself, Dwight Gooden. But the real key to Clark's performance that game came near the end, when Clark walked with the bases loaded to tie the ball game. Well, taking walks isn't sexy. I mean, it's certainly not as sexy as stealing bases, but it's absolutely vital. Clark's ability to get on base is what set him apart, and his excellent slugging abilities turned the St. Louis offense into one of the best offenses of the 1980s. I really want to hammer this point home. Whitey Herzog's Cardinals had always been aggressive on the base paths, like in this crazy play by Dane Orge in 1981. It's not like Coleman came and started doing things differently. Lonnie Smith was also forcing the opposing defense into mistakes in 1984, but that didn't help the Cardinals win. One of the things that everybody forgot in the late 1970s and early 1980s is that aggressive base running comes at a huge cost. Actually, you know, I love speed on the base paths, but I've got to agree with the sabermetricians here. Aggressive base running really does more harm than good. And the thing is that Whitey Herzog really should have known that. Whitey's famous brand of aggressive baseball, known as Whitey Ball, started when he took over as Kansas City Royals manager way back in 1975. In fact, if you watch Kansas City Royals games from the late 1970s, you'll think you're actually watching the 1985 Cardinals. They're that similar. Whitey had his runners moving all the time.
Inside, Lecoq going, throw through, safe. The throw was off.
He also used intimidation tactics to try to scare pitchers into balking. Crazy thing is that it worked. Well, sometimes it worked and sometimes it failed spectacularly. We don't have a lot of video of late 1970s games, but it's not hard to see the problems with Whitey Ball when we watch what we do have. Thurman Munson was particularly adept at throwing out Royals base stealers during those league championship series in the late 1970s. It's actually a little strange today to see superstars like George Brett being thrown out trying to steal second like this. In Game 3 of the 1978 ALCS, George Brett had already hit 2 home runs and was at the plate when Freddie Patek was thrown out trying to steal. This was the third out. Brett hit a third home run when he led off the next inning, and of course, the Royals lost the game by a single run. If that wasn't enough, Amos Otis ran himself into a double play earlier in that same game. This is where aggressive base running becomes absolutely ridiculous. And here's Frank White being easily doubled off first base in Game 4 of that series. He doesn't even try to get back to first. And so, while many of us fondly remember famous highlights like Willie Wilson hitting this inside-the-park walk-off home run to win a game in 1979, we've got to keep in mind that these occasional victories came at a huge price. And really, the 1985 Cardinals were not immune from ridiculous base-running mistakes. In fact, I've compiled some of those for you to illustrate this point. I guess you could chalk this one up to Tito Landrum making a mental mistake, though I think it's really because the team was being too aggressive. From that same game, Willie McGee hit a ground ball to the right side, moving Vince Coleman to second. Coleman then scored on an infield error. What you don't see, though, is that the Cardinals were down by 4 at this time late in the ballgame. That's not exactly time to start playing small ball. That's really what Coleman's biggest problem was, by the way. He was almost exclusively a small ball player. This was Coleman's only home run in 1985. Of course, it was an inside-the-park homer that remains absolutely thrilling to watch. Now, Vince did occasionally hit for power, such as this triple against the Cubs that easily scored John Tudor from first base.
Tudor may score as he stumbles around the bases. Coleman goes for third. The throw home. He is safe with a head-first slide. A triple for Coleman. And the Cardinals lead 3-0.
There's also this game in August against the Cubs where Coleman got an easy triple to right field after another defensive mistake. However, a lot of Coleman's 1985 hits look like this one, a bloop single into no man's land.
Can't get there. Ozzie Smith will score.
In fact, a lot of the so-called power that Coleman had came because of awful fielding plays like this one. And Coleman wasn't the only perpetrator here, of course. Opposing fans hated Willie McGee for doing this sort of thing, beating out infield singles, which he did regularly. Artificial turf base hits like this one were McGee's bread and butter for his entire career. Now, there's nothing wrong with getting on first base, of course, but you kind of wish that the man would drive the ball once in a while. And then McGee also made crazy mistakes. This looks like a routine sacrifice fly to score a run, right? Well, look closely. McGee left second base too early and was called out on an appeal play.
It looked like McGee had about 3 steps to Jorgensen's 1. Engel was in good position.
As fast as Coleman was, he was also very susceptible to pickoff plays like this one. And then there was the Ozzie Smith problem. Smith had an awful tendency to hit into double plays when it really counted.
There's one and the other, and that'll do it.
Even Vince Coleman hit into a few double plays, something you think would be impossible given all his speed. Well, I could go on. All of that aggressive base running really was a mixed bag. And the funny thing is that the Cardinals didn't really win because they had over 300 stolen bases. It was really their power that pushed them over the top. Now, some of that power came because of speed. Lonnie Smith's triple here would be a double for almost any Major League player today.
Into the gap. Coleman's going to score easily behind Ozzie Smith. And it's now a 6-2 ball game. Smith on third base.
Jack Clark was known to hit a triple now and again. He wasn't exactly slow. And even Willie McGee occasionally really got into one despite the crater-sized hole in his swing.
Ball goes down into the corner. Bosley digs it out with 2 out. McGee's trying for third. He is safe.
But it was the long ball power that helped the Cardinals out in a pinch. St. Louis only hit 87 of these all season, but they sure seemed to come at important moments. Jack Clark was particularly proficient at destroying pitches like this one against the Expos. And the pennant clincher against the Cubs came largely thanks to this monster home run by Cesar Cedeno. The Cardinals' power was most evident in the postseason, as a matter of fact. Sure, there were stolen bases against the Dodgers in the NLCS. However, there were also really bad base running plays like this one. And sometimes Whitey Ball was a bit excessive. St. Louis was down by 3 here when Jack Clark bunted for a base hit. A home run would have been nicer. I mean, stolen bases like this one by Coleman were impressive, don't get me wrong. And it's always helpful when you can do this sort of thing to the opposition. But Tommy Herr's monster home run here was a little bit more effective. The question here, of course, is whether Herr could have had more success as a hitter if he wasn't taking pitches to let McGee try to steal. Then came the famous tarp incident on October 13th, right before Game 4 of the NLCS. The injury was scary at first. Vince Coleman wound up being fine, but was unable to play for the rest of the postseason. Of course, it wasn't speed that won the NLCS for the Cardinals. It was power, like this famous bomb from Ozzie Smith. It was also this triple by Ozzie Smith in the 6th game of the NLCS. And the final blow came not from a stolen base, but from a monster shot off the back of Jack Clark. Well, now we get to the World Series. There are people to this day who think that the 1985 Cardinals would have won easily if Vince Coleman had been able to play. They look at the abysmal St. Louis stolen base record in the World Series to come to that conclusion. Actually, I disagree. Actually, the Cardinals ran the bases very aggressively at the beginning of the series. This was the second and last successful St. Louis stolen base of the 1985 World Series. You can see some of that St. Louis power in the extra base hits they managed. It also showed up from time to time when the Cardinals forced Kansas City into making mistakes. But the problem is that the Royals didn't make a lot of defensive mistakes. Kansas City pitching also didn't allow a lot of base runners. The Kansas City fielders, after all, were a little bit better than the Chicago Cubs fielders. Willie McGee got greedy here, trying to stretch a double into a triple. Tommy Herr learned that George Brett was indeed a good fielder. And Jack Clark learned as well that it wasn't a good idea to try to stretch a double into a triple.
Concepcion runs right at him as he should. Now to Brett, and Brett throws to White, and Jack is gone.
You've got to wonder how Game 3 would have been different if Willie McGee hadn't foolishly tried to steal third base here. Ozzie Smith found himself picked off first base this time.
So Smith gets caught the wrong way, and Balboni throwing to Biancalana. Biancalana to Sundberg covering.
And here's Jack Clark being thrown out after trying to stretch yet another base hit. Willie McGee was also a little bit too aggressive here. It seems that the St. Louis base runners had a real hard time trying to figure out the moves the Kansas City pitchers were using. Actually, you know, if the Cardinals had been a little bit more patient and had relied on their power, things might have been different. Tito Landrum wound up being the star for St. Louis, playing in place of Vince Coleman. As good as Coleman was, he never hit one out like this during the 1985 season. And Willie McGee showed more of that power that he demonstrated in the 1982 World Series. Okay, we're going to ignore Game 7 of the World Series where the Cardinals did absolutely nothing on offense. Game 6 is the game that everybody talks about. That's because of this famous bad call at first base, of course. But the real strange thing about Game 6 is that Whitey decided to lead off with Ozzie Smith, one of his weakest hitters. With 2 men on and only 1 out in the top of the 6th, Ozzie took a really bad swing and ground into a double play. That's absolutely not what you wanted to have happen here. Brian Harper's single gave the Cardinals their 1-0 lead.
A little soft looper, and it's into center for a base hit, and the Cardinals take the lead.
That same inning, Charlie Leibrandt winced after this close pitch to Ozzie Smith was called a ball. Smith walked on the next pitch. Thankfully, he didn't swing at it. However, Willie McGee then grounded out softly, ending what should have been a huge inning. Okay, in my opinion, the Cardinals likely don't win the 1985 World Series even with Vince Coleman. They needed less speed and more power, and they also needed a manager who wasn't going to have Ozzie Smith hit leadoff. But what do you think? Let me know down below.